Thank you so much for joining us today. So the Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative today published a new discussion paper called Teachings of Sustainability, Stewardship and Responsibility, Indigenous Perspectives on Obligation, Wealth, Trusts, and Fiduciary Duty. We're gathered here together various Indigenous teachings and laws that it presents. We're grateful to be recording this broadcasting from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And thank you all for joining us from across Turtle Island and beyond. The session has been organized by the Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative, or RRII, a joint project from NATOA and SHARE. NATOA, the National Aboriginal Trust Officers Association, is a charity organization committed to providing resources for Indigenous peoples to help them efficiently create, manage, and operate trusts to ensure that the 7 generations yet unborn can benefit from the goals and dreams of the present generation. SHARE is a nonprofit that mobilizes investor leadership for a sustainable, inclusive, and productive economy. We do this by building responsible investment leadership among asset owners like pension funds, religious organizations, and trusts, and amplifying investor voices in support of improved corporate sustainability practices and better governance of capital markets. And the Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative works in partnership with both Indigenous investors and a broader network of institutional investors, mobilizing to integrate Indigenous values and ways of knowing into our capital markets, advance reconciliation, and build a vibrant Indigenous economy. Before I introduce our speakers today, I'd like to share a bit of context on this work and how it got started. So financial settlements such as specific claims agreements and impact benefit agreements have resulted in the creation of trusts. Indigenous trustees oversee these financial assets for the benefit of others, who often constitute current and future generations. As such, they're bound by their duty as fiduciaries, including a duty of loyalty and a duty to act in good faith to the trust's beneficiaries. Yet some trustees have shared concerns that fiduciary duty as expressed in Canadian law narrowly interprets their obligations. This can lead boards of trustees and their agents, such as asset managers, to focus exclusively on shorter-term financial returns while disregarding an understanding of fiduciary duty that is grounded in Indigenous legal orders. Current understandings and enactments of fiduciary duty do not explicitly incorporate Indigenous laws and traditions related to the stewardship of collective assets. And so back in the spring, we approached Dr. Burrows with a few key questions. Among them, we asked, what can Indigenous laws teach us about the duties of trustees? What is an Indigenous law understanding of the duties of someone who holds trusts in assets in trust for the benefit of others? How does Indigenous law speak to the issues of applying Indigenous values and beliefs in investment policy? And do Indigenous law understandings conflict or contrast with fiduciary standards as understood in Canadian or provincial law? And if so, what is the basis for resolution? These questions form the core of the research that Shayla, Praud, and John then undertook this summer. These questions on fiduciary duty feel all the more current today as debates unfold across North America on the adherence to a uniform fiduciary standard. So to introduce our speakers today, Research Associate Shayla Praud is a Canadian Common Law and Indigenous Legal Orders, or JD/JID candidate at the University of Victoria. Shayla is descended from the Eagle clan from the community of Lekalzap of the Nisga'a Nation. We're also joined by Dr. John Burrows, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria. His accolades and publications are extensive, but most recently, as far as I know at least, Dr. Burrows received the Governor General's Innovation Award in recognition that he has helped transform Canada's understanding of how Indigenous and non-Indigenous law can coexist harmoniously. John is a Anishinaabe and a member of the Chippewa of the Nawash First Nation. We are so grateful to have worked with Shayla and John on this project, which was conducted in partnership with the Circle on Philanthropy and with support from the Cube Foundation. Throughout the presentation that follows, we would encourage you to send in any questions that arise along the way via the Q&A box, which should appear at the border of your Zoom window. After Shayla and John have shared their remarks, I'll direct as many questions as I can towards the pair of them at the end of the session for further discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar today. So I am broadcasting from traditional Lekwungen speaking territory, specifically Oak Bay in Victoria. And as Katie so eloquently introduced, today we'll be discussing aspects of the research that John and I have been engaged with over the summer, and in partnership with the RRII as led by Cher and Natoa. So on our agenda today, we will begin by describing the purpose of the research and an overview of the structure of our work. Next, we will briefly talk about some of the challenges that we encountered and wanted to recognize. We will then discuss some of the materials that we examined and explore some of our findings. We will then summarize, conclude, and open up the floor to questions for further discussion. So throughout the last couple of months, as per the purpose of this research, we've been exploring various Indigenous conceptions of stewardship, loyalty, obligation, and wealth as they pertain to fiduciary duty. So for those of you who don't know or would appreciate a refresher, a fiduciary duty is a unique and complex obligation in which one party is required to ensure the best interests of another when they're in a trust-like relationship. So some examples of this type of relationship include a lawyer to their client, a trustee to their beneficiaries, and the federal government to Indigenous peoples. As quoted by Dr. Leonard Rotman, the fiduciary concept is the purest doctrinal expression of equity that prioritizes the protection of public confidence and trusted relationships as central to its conceptualization. We're exploring these notions specifically in relation to the holding of financial assets in trust for and by Indigenous peoples. But why is this important? Why is it so crucial to begin to think about the integration of Indigenous legal principles in common law and contemporary frameworks? I'll pass it over to John to explore these questions and others in a little bit more depth here.
Great, wonderful to be with you all. This notion of Indigenous wealth is something that has to be thought of in a broad and holistic perspective. It is the case that, of course, Indigenous peoples want to secure high return on investment in financial markets and see the monetary value of their assets increase. But it's also important to note that Indigenous peoples have measures of wealth that have been in their communities from time immemorial. That is the wealth that's found in our relationships with the natural world, the water and rocks and fire and wind, the insects, plants, animals, and birds, the relationships that we have in clans and in families. These are forms of wealth for Indigenous peoples that aren't easily measured by financial return. Likewise, we have relationships with our neighboring nations. And while we sometimes don't get along, and now we often just tease one another, those forms of wealth can be such that they bring great strength to us. Likewise, we have relationships with many non-Indigenous entities and people and opportunities. And so the importance of this is to see that we understand obligation and duty and wealth and responsibility in that wider frame. I see Dara Cully's on the call here. This notion of economies of affection are what is partially motivating our work to see that we have ways of understanding our possibilities through a broader lens. And those are often developed within our legal traditions. We do have standards, principles, criteria authorities, measures, precedents, traditions that are resources there for resolving our disputes and regulating our affairs. And so part of this work here is to see Indigenous peoples' laws as being necessary in relating to wealth and understanding not only financial return, which is hugely important, we do not want to underestimate that, but also seeing that in existence and alongside these other ideas. So if we take Indigenous law, Indigenous legal principles as a part of our measures, that will start to shift how we manage, allocate, find our responsibilities in this field. Part of this is also rooted in the call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which suggested to corporate Canada that there needs to be ways to work with and incorporate and listen to Indigenous peoples when they're acting in relationship to our communities. And then finally, this notion of just working in context. I know that's what all advisors and all trust managers and fiduciaries are charged with doing. But if that context does not appreciate, take account of, and integrate Indigenous people's laws, then we are not going to be measuring, judging, creating standards or criteria in accordance with those things that might be crucially important for Indigenous peoples in their varied communities across the land. And so the purpose there, overview, is to really get at this broader conception, this broader scheme. And it's been just a pleasure to work with Shayla over the summer. She's been fantastic as a researcher and a writer, and also to work with Cher and Natoa to be able to pull together this broader view of what we are presenting here for you. These are our first thoughts, and yes, it's going to appear formally on the web here as a report and a publication, but Shayla and I eventually want to take this further and publish this in an academic forum as well. So we're looking for feedback as well as presenting here, because this is a living document that will continue to grow as this is our first foray into a field where there's a gap in the literature and people haven't expressed themselves in the way that they might, given that we've not considered Indigenous law as a part of this field. So it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to open a space that might otherwise not be so prominent. Over to you, Shayla.
Thanks so much, Sean. So to accomplish some of our summer research, we've been examining the utilization of relevant principles within traditional frameworks, such as traditional stories and oral histories, as well as contemporary frameworks, such as constitutions, agreements and treaties, plans, and policies that integrate traditional values. So we explored these in a few nations that we were already a bit familiar with, such as our own Anishinaabe and Nisga'a nations, as well as those of the Gitxsan, the Cree, the Inklakatma, Mi'kmaq, and Kwanlin Dune nations. We've also seen some good work come out of New Zealand regarding Indigenous notions of wealth over there, so we wanted to include some Maori perspectives as well. We attempted to explore a small variety of Indigenous communities that are situated throughout Canada. The Nisga'a Nation, for example, is situated in the Nass Valley in northern British Columbia, while the Gitxsan Nation borders the Nisga'a with very similar language and clan structures. The Cree territories are widely distributed throughout Canada, so we briefly explored some of the Cree nations, such as the Swampy Cree of James Bay and Hudson Bay in Manitoba, the Plains Cree in Saskatchewan, and the Cree Nation of Eosti, which governs 11 Cree communities located primarily in northern Quebec. The Anishinaabe people widely reside throughout eastern North America, which includes areas in both Canada and the United States, primarily around the Great Lakes. The Mi'kmaq territories make up the areas now recognized as Canada's Atlantic provinces, as well as the northeastern region of Maine in the United States. The Inklakatma Nation encompasses 15 communities in southern British Columbia and northern Washington. And finally, the Kwanlin Dune First Nation territory is located in Whitehorse, Yukon. Once we explored these nations and some of the traditional and contemporary frameworks that they've established, we then looked into Indigenous law and rights within Canadian case law. So the majority of case law precedent has historically overlooked Indigenous interests and has often had detrimental effects on Indigenous rights. At the same time, Indigenous peoples turn to Canadian law to advance their rights and interests. The Supreme Court of Canada has identified a framework for seeing Indigenous law on its own terms before considering its relationship to the common law. This framework comes from the Latin term sui generis, which translates to of its own kind or class, and recognizes the unique nature of Indigenous laws. We'll discuss this framework a little bit more later on. Finally, our project seeks to illuminate some of the inflexibility and under-inclusiveness of universal trust and investment principles that are based largely on short-term financial gain. And although it's not the focus of our project, we did want to briefly touch on some of the challenges that currently exist within trust law as it pertains to the regulation of Indigenous trust structures and the capacity of Indigenous trustees and decision makers to exercise their fiduciary obligations. Now, as John mentioned, of course, every Indigenous community will strive for a high return on their investments. We just simply want to highlight that many want wealth returned to them in other ways as well. And we want this to be acknowledged and respected by external financial advisors, wealth managers, investment brokers, and other external groups. Our hope is that this work will provide some insight that might be used in a variety of ways, such as the assistance and the empowerment of Indigenous decision makers to steward financial assets in ways that align with their own community laws and traditions. We might also hope that we may provide some information for non-Indigenous entities that may be looking to connect or partner with Indigenous entities, or incorporate some elements of Indigenous values into their practice to promote inclusivity. Now, there are a variety of challenges that emerge with this kind of work that we think it's important to acknowledge throughout our writing. The first is that fiduciary duty is an equity concept and therefore will not fit perfectly into Indigenous legal principles, or vice versa, nor should they. There will always be limitations to the extent over which a concept developed in one legal tradition can be used to illuminate a very different legal tradition. We also recognize that we are outsiders to many of these legal orders and will never really be able to understand them the way that they're really meant to be understood, being on the land and through traditional languages spoken by knowledge keepers, storytellers, and elders. We must also reiterate that we're only discussing a very small portion of legal orders in a small number of nations and communities, and there are hundreds of communities throughout Canada. Although we're broadly discussing various principles, we do not and we cannot assume that the themes and the values that are present throughout our work are shared by all nations, communities, leaders, investors, and trustees. Values, aspirations, and pathways do vary, and they will be distinct to every community. So moving on to the findings of our work, I'll begin by exploring some themes that were present within the narratives and traditional legal principles that we explored. However, just before I dive into that, I think it's important to highlight that the varied sources of Indigenous law described throughout our work are not exhaustive in any way, shape, or form, nor are they locked into silos. Collectively, duties, entitlements, and obligations can be recorded in dances, narratives, traditional stories, and songs that are told through traditional languages and depict history, teachings, and connection. These laws grow from tragedy and happiness, humor and seriousness, fear and struggle, triumph, wisdom, and beauty. They form the legal orders by which many Indigenous nations live and learn by. These ancient and sophisticated laws have been passed through generations for thousands of years, and they've been modified as the need arises. They were here before the arrival of non-Indigenous people, and although some have been lost, others have remained in the face of assimilation, suppression, and eradication. So themes of responsibility, obligation, respect, and stewardship were at the forefront of almost all of the narratives that we looked at. Some teachings are communicated through trickster characters, such as the Nishka Clemsum, Gitsan's Wiget, Maori's Maui, and the Anishinaabe trickster Nanabush. Although they're not always present, trickster characters form a very large part of traditional stories and oral histories. They have powers of transformation in some cases and may serve as the being who is punished for acts of disrespect or things like harvesting in some stories, while in others, they may serve as the hero, enacting justice on others who abuse their power and may not act in the best interests of others or their communities. A wide range of teachings are present throughout narratives, such as those relating to listening to elders, respecting living creatures, and protecting the natural environment, as well as attitudes against greed and selfishness. Many of the narratives also expressed consequences of not following these teachings, such as in the form of natural disasters, shaming, and attacks by spirits. Narratives also work to connect people to the land and to their territories. Throughout each nation's narratives that we looked at, there were stories that depicted such a wide range of connections. Things like why mosquitoes exist, why lynxes have tufted ears, how birch trees and buzzards acquired their physical characteristics, how features of the landscape came to be, and why mountains and regions and rivers are named what they are. Everything and everyone has a purpose on this earth, and many, if not all of these narratives very strongly communicated that. Narratives that connect people to the land, plants, animals, waters, and to each other create value and conceptions of non-monetary wealth and such a depth of appreciation and respect for them that's just simply not conveyed in Western laws and in most cases, Western ways of thinking. They create histories that are passed down through generations, and through their teachings, many Indigenous peoples feel a sense of stewardship and responsibility towards these things to ensure that they're able to be enjoyed and appreciated by generations to come. Many narratives are informed by established traditional legal frameworks, such as the Nishka, or the Anishinaabe Seven Sacred Teachings, which are also known as the Seven Grandfather, Grandmother, or Ancestral Teachings. The teachings of the legal orders that inform oral histories and traditional stories are also prevalent within the nation's constitutions that we examined. All of the nations that we looked at use their constitutions to express their community's traditional values and legal principles in contemporary frameworks. So we believed it was important to include these types of documents because although these constitutions are influenced by the common law, they've been created and used by nations to share with, inform, and instruct their communities as well as non-Indigenous peoples. They've also been used to preserve many of the previously mentioned traditional principles. Some constitutions were heavily influenced by these legal principles, while others incorporated aspects of common law principles to create a blend of multiple different legal orders. They all had aspects that were either written in their traditional languages, such as the photo on the right of the preamble of the Anishinaabe Constitution, which is called the Anishinaabe Chinaakinagewin and is written expressly in the Anishinaabe-Moan language, or that clearly articulated their fundamental traditional values that had been in place since time immemorial, which ended up following a lot of the same themes as those present within the traditional stories. We also wanted to include some self-governance and land and resource agreements because many communities have negotiated these with the federal and provincial governments with the intention of benefiting their nations and communities. For example, the Nishka Final Agreement was also used to negotiate the protection, management, and oversight of the Nishka Memorial Lava Bed Park, pictured in the top right corner here, which is culturally and ceremonially significant. Additionally, we included a couple of plans and policies that have been put forward by communities as another framework to accomplish Indigenous obligations as protectors of their people, culture, heritage, and land. For example, the Kanakabar Band of the Inklakatma Nation has, among other things, created a climate change vulnerability assessment, which guides decision-making as well as highlights the paramountcy that some communities value regarding environmental sustainability for those who are currently living and then also those who have yet to come. So once we gathered information on Indigenous principles and frameworks, we moved on to the inclusion of some information from Canadian jurisprudence. focusing specifically on the notion of sui generis, which again, as I mentioned previously, translates to of its own kind or class, as pertaining to Indigenous rights. So this notion was used to describe Indigenous rights first in the Guerin case in 1984, and through cases such as Simon, Sparrow, and Delgamuukw, has expanded to include title and treaty rights. Now again, we wanted to include this to acknowledge that amidst the detrimental effects that case law has had on Indigenous rights, laws, and interests, and while there are dangers in using this framework, we just wanted to acknowledge that such a concept may support the growth of Indigenous laws and interests alongside or within the common law. We also wanted to briefly acknowledge the prevalence of things like ESG, impact investing, and intergenerational equity in corporations and investment practices. So ESG, which stands for the inclusion of environmental, social, and governance considerations, is used in investment and corporate practices, often beneath financial implications when it comes to decision-making. Impact investing is a lesser-known approach, but may possibly be more focused to the prioritization of non-financial matters than ESG is. Rather than favoring financial returns over non-financial considerations, impact investing seeks to recognize financial returns alongside or secondary to non-financial considerations. Intergenerational equity is a term that incorporates long-term considerations potentially. These include the considerations of multiple generations, including those who are living and those who will be in the future. We wanted to recognize that these notions do exist in corporate and contemporary law, but have only fairly recently begun to garner wider support due to the emergence of implications and information that ESG might actually have financial implications. So due to this motivator, ESG is increasingly being seen as a part of fiduciary duty. So again, we wanted to acknowledge that these factors do exist in Western principles, but that they have existed within Indigenous obligatory considerations for much longer, just without the sole motivators of profit loss or profit gain. They just didn't call it ESG or impact investing or socially responsible investing. They called it doing what's right. They called it doing what's beneficial and in the best interests of their communities, but also their land, the waters, and other beings. The prevalence of ESG investing, impact investing, and intergenerational equity, and other concepts in the mainstream investing world show us that policies, practices, and law associated with investing is very much capable of expanding and evolving over time. This means that the inclusion of Indigenous viewpoints and laws in investment and trust governance is very much possible. So when it comes to modern notions of best interest practices, many communities have stewarded their financial assets into trusts. So the benefits of a trust structure is that there's transparency and accountability regarding the holding and allocation of funds. Trust structures are also very flexible, which allows for a variety of structures to suit the individual requirements of each community. However, trust law in Canada has not evolved to include these new types of trusts, which also creates a variety of problems for Indigenous trustees and trust managers. We do want to point out that due to the flexible nature of trusts and the different infrastructures of each nation or community, conflicts and complications are very distinct between community trusts. The ones that we explored will not affect every group nor everyone in the same way. Some variables, such as whether the community is classified as a band under the Indian Act, and whether a community has negotiated their own agreements with the federal government, will affect how and if some of these common issues might impact them directly. There are also a number of ways that these issues might be addressed, but again, will vary depending on the community and the trust structure. So just to briefly list a couple of these issues, the rule of perpetuities, which is an ancient and notoriously complex rule that is still in effect by statute in all but 3 provinces, limits the holding of trust assets for extended periods of time. Now, although there is a lot to unpack with this rule, I'll just say that this can complicate Indigenous trusts that are meant to be held for the benefit of future generations, of which most of them are. Tax regulations can also complicate trusts. There are a wide range of tax issues that will present differently depending on the infrastructure of the community. So I'll just briefly mention that tax regulations, among other things, often fail to consider the unique nature and context of Indigenous trusts. These trusts are meant to assist communities with attaining long-term sustainability and economic independence. Yet, unlike municipal, provincial, or federal treasury funds, they can be subject to potentially high rates of tax that depletes money that's meant to provide desperately needed services for the betterment of these communities. Fiduciary law is a related area that might also have some challenges relating to the obligation of Indigenous trustees. Some discussion has begun to emerge around the expansion of fiduciary law to include beneficiaries that are not yet born, but it doesn't really quite seem to be captured to the same extent as Indigenous decision makers when it comes to investment strategies and best interest considerations. For example, many Indigenous communities consider the impact of decisions on multiple generations to come rather than just the immediately succeeding one. One trustee that I spoke to in preparation for this research previously mentioned that she recognizes the scope of her decision-making consideration to her grandchildren's grandchildren. 7 generations is another term that kind of illustrates the scope of these considerations. So to conclude, academics have been saying for years that these challenges and others regarding the law of trust really need to be addressed in legislation in order to provide clarity that is specific and sensitive to the unique nature of Indigenous trusts. But this is a good example of how contemporary law has yet to evolve to include or consider Indigenous interests, viewpoints, and values. Now, there is a possibility that Indigenous trusts may eventually be presumed to be sui generis as well, due to their unique nature and their operation within factions that have already been deemed to be sui generis, such as Indigenous rights, title, and by extension, laws. The establishment of Indigenous trust structures as sui generis, as well as the creation of Indigenous-informed legislation that properly addresses them in their unique nature, may assist with the remedies of some of the issues that have been brought forward by Indigenous trustees. All of the nations that we've explored throughout our work have trust structures of some kind in place that vary, again, depending on the needs, requirements, values, and challenges of every individual community. We know that there is a need for clarity, and we've just tried to suggest some ways that Indigenous people's own values, norms, standards, principles, processes, precedents, and authorities can guide decision-making in this field. Many Indigenous decision makers incorporate their nation's traditional principles and values in considering how their decisions will impact not only their people in the present day, but also future generations, as well as plants, animals, their lands, and waters. Notions of fiduciary duty are very much present in traditional Indigenous legal principles. Yet, questions remain. How are Indigenous trustees to enact their fiduciary duties as prudent investors when, in many cases, they're attempting to reconcile conflicting legal principles in various jurisdictions? These questions and others like it really need to be addressed in order to overcome historical injustices and allow for the inclusion of Indigenous viewpoints and laws in investment and trust governance. In an attempt to abolish Indigenous peoples' laws and languages, colonial law has historically been forced onto Indigenous communities. But we're now in an era where it's time for Indigenous legal orders and values to be used to inform broader law in Canada. Now is the time for change. Now is the time to listen. Thank you all so much for taking the time to listen. That concludes the presentation portion of our webinar. John, would you like to add anything else before we move into the question segment?
Yes, just to say that our methodology here is trying to take seriously different bodies of information, ideas, and practice, legal approaches on their own terms. So understanding the Anishinaabe on its own terms, the Niska, Inklipakmuk, Maori, other folks, and really give that some priority and precedence so that, ideas, that others will look into their own distinct, unique forms and try to draw out those principles that are there around wealth and responsibility, stewardship and obligation, entitlement. And so that's one of the first steps that we've got here. But then we're trying to bring these bodies of knowledge, information, and practice into contact with one another through comparison and contrast, and bring these bodies of knowledge and practice together in relationship to the common law, legislation, and more general Western legal practice when it comes to dealing with these issues of wealth management. And as we bring these bodies of knowledge together, that's our methodology, we have the fortune of having the Supreme Court of Canada, when it examines Aboriginal right, also provide a methodology that is about harmonization or reconciliation, or trying to find ways that they can interact together productively. In a case called the Queen versus Vanderpeet, the court said a morally and politically defensible conception of Aboriginal rights will incorporate both legal perspectives. That is, the perspectives on law that Indigenous peoples might have, and their perspective on law that would come from the common law and equity. Our suggestion here then is just to work by way of analogy from that statement to say that a morally and politically defensible conception of fiduciary duty and trust law will incorporate both the Indigenous legal perspective alongside the common law and equitable ideas. And since we're dealing with Indigenous issues, that incorporation should also recognize the power imbalance that's been there in the past that's tended to privilege Western forms of wealth management and stewardship and responsibility and obligation. And so if those power relations have been there that have been excluding Indigenous peoples from their participation, a morally and politically defensible conception of trust law or fiduciary law that incorporates both legal perspectives must also recognize that we've had difficulty in getting those Indigenous perspectives in there, such that we would kind of put our finger on the scale, as it were, and create some room for Indigenous law, values, teachings, ethics to come forward in this fashion. And so that's the methodology that we've used here, taking Indigenous law seriously on its own terms, and then thinking in Canadian law, in the rights paradigm, there is this methodology of reconciliation. The court says that's the purpose of Section 35(1) of the Constitution, but reconciliation will not happen without truth and without the resurgence of Indigenous law. And so this is the notion here, that the resurgence of Indigenous law will be an important part of getting at the right relationship that brings back into the picture the natural world, that our reconciliation with one another as peoples is actually premised on our reconciliation with the earth. And so Indigenous law, and all the ways that Shayla has presented, provides opportunities for thinking about these kinds of working with systems, be they separate, parallel, or interrelated in some way, in a kind of active way, in a way that thinks about our opportunities, because the legislature might not act tomorrow, when the rule against perpetuities might not be changed by the courts for some time, but we that are working in the field or have an interest in the field can start to think about and act in our own spheres as to how Indigenous law, teachings, values, ethics around wealth, obligation, fiduciary, whatever those analogies might be, can become not just more prominent, but in the communities that they're being used in, can really guide the decision-making in ways that is holistic, as I was mentioning at the outset. So that's our work. And I know we're going to be taking questions here in a second. And so I'll just turn it back over to Catherine to help us set that portion of our webinar up.
Great. Thank you both so much for that, Shayla and John. That was, I think, a really, really helpful overview of all that you were able to uncover in the previous months doing this research. So thank you for providing that. For those that would like to look at the discussion paper in full, it is available at reconciliationandinvestment.ca. on the website under the resources tab, and you can read that full paper. I am going to turn now to the questions that have come in for the panelists. So thank you to those that have submitted questions so far. If you haven't gotten a chance yet, please send them our way. So the first question that came in would be the following. Can you elaborate on the idea of right relationships, including with the natural environment, stewarded in Indigenous law, which is not clearly understood or included in Western fiduciary duty concepts?
Shayla, do you want to just take that first and then I will add?
I don't know if I fully understood you, Katie. I think you might have cut out a little bit.
Sure, I can repeat it.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
It was, can you elaborate on the idea of right relationships? So including those with the natural environment being an asset to be stewarded in Indigenous law, which is not clearly understood or included in Western fiduciary duty concepts. So it's getting at that idea of the right relationships, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to relationships of sort of between the natural environment, I mean, I've actually just recently learned in my contracts class that in Western conceptions of what we're trying to understand this is like, it's giving animals and the land and the waters agency and animacy. And this is conveyed in other types of legal orders languages as well. In Anishinaabe language, for example, gives animacy to these things. It gives them a sense of being with us, of being on the same level as us. And it really kind of puts forward that notion that these relationships are so important, and not only for long-term sustainability for the animals themselves, but for us as people. We depend on these relationships and they depend on us, and being able to sort of coexist in the natural world is something that is considered of the utmost importance in many Indigenous communities. So I don't know, John, if you want to add to that a little bit more.
I can remember learning this from one of my elders, Basil Johnson, who was trying to explain these obligations that we have to the natural world around us. And he also then put the shoe on the other foot and said, you know, these watersheds and species and communities of animals and plants and insects and fish are also taking care of us. That is, they are stewarding us. They are acting as if they're wanting to have this intergenerational relationship with us. That is, we are intertwined with one another. And so it's a little bit inaccurate just to think about us having a trust-like responsibility towards the natural world, because it's a reciprocity here, and that the natural world itself is also in a trust-like relationship, trying to enact its reproduction in a way that ensures that all those parts are maintained. And so that the idea of the natural world having an animacy or being legal agents, or being subjects, not just subjects of the law, but participants in the law, is a part of this idea. You might be aware in New Zealand, rivers have been recognized as having legal capacity, and they can participate in decision-making through board-like structures that take account of Maori tikanga, Maori law in doing that work. And there are other places in the world where part of the idea is to try to hear and listen to and place into our decision-making structures the needs, interests, place of the natural world that surrounds us.
Thank you both for that. Another question that has been posed by the audience is there a place where the current application of fiduciary duty to Indigenous trusts collides most strongly with Indigenous legal orders that then needs to be reconciled?
So I think the points that Shayla brought up in the presentation around the rule against perpetuities, which says you can't create long-term set of restrictions on resources and land, because the idea is that you don't want the dead binding the living. And so trust law generally tries to get rid of any restrictions that the living has placed on the dead after 20+1 years. And for Indigenous peoples that have this intergenerational 7-generation views of what we've been given from those that have pre-exist us, and how that should guide us in today's term, that rule against perpetuities is a challenge. Likewise, the deemed disposition of trust assets every 20 years can prevent Indigenous peoples from further building their relations. And then just the professional responsibilities that wealth managers have in the way that we've got these structures, it might not be directing them to take account of these broader issues that we're trying to identify here. So I'm not sure that there's one can really be said universally to be more pressing than the others. It depends on the context that you're in. But those are three of the huge challenges that exist for many communities.
Great, thank you for that. Someone has commented, it strikes me that trust law brings with it some very unhelpful assumptions about the deficiencies of the beneficiaries and thus the need for trustees. How do we overcome the idea that trustees have some kind of elevated stature or knowledge compared to the beneficiaries?
So I have a colleague, Len Rotman, who teaches fiduciary law and trust law, corporate law, and Indigenous law. He was at Dalhousie and now he's at Ryerson. And he says we have to think about the mutuality of some of these ideas of beneficiary necessarily always being vulnerable. He gives the example of just in a fiduciary context of, let's say someone is wanting to engage in mineral exploration and development. Well, the geologist would have some sort of, and they're investing together, the geologist would have some sort of advantage over the investor in doing this work because he has the professional knowledge to be able to read the rocks and to know where there might be opportunities to find particular geological formations that could be financially beneficial. So there's some, higher possibility of knowledge that person has. On the other hand, the investor with the money has the money, and so there's a bit of an advantage that that investor has. And if that investor doesn't extend the money to the geologist, and they're in this kind of fiduciary-like relationship, then the geologist can't go about doing the work that he or she is charged with doing. In other words, they both hold a piece of the puzzle. It's not like one is always in a hierarchical relationship with the trust being above and the beneficiary being below. The knowledge of the geologist and the money that the investor brings to bear, they're kind of in a mutual set of strength and vulnerabilities. And if we thought of the relationships that we're in, particularly with the natural world, in dealing with wealth and obligation and fiduciary and duties, etc., I think that would be a better formulation of what we're talking about. And you're right, trust law doesn't always do that. Fiduciary law doesn't always regard us as being entangled with one another in both positive and negative ways. It's often thought that these beneficiaries are the vulnerable ones without much agency, and yet what Len is suggesting and how we can try to reformulate trust law and fiduciary law if we take account of Indigenous legal traditions is to see that we all have a piece of that pie, or we all can bring our strengths to bear in these relationships. And yes, there are vulnerabilities that we also bring there, but it doesn't necessarily always put us in a a necessarily hierarchical position where one takes predominance or priority over another. They just have different gifts and different skills, and they have to be, as we've been talking about, reconciled together or harmonized or put into parallel with one another if it's best that they're kept separate in some instances, to respect the messiness of our affairs, but in ways that doesn't replicate the hierarchy that sometimes comes with fiduciary and trust law.
Great, thank you for that. Another comment that has come in is that one of the key shifts that you have illuminated through this work is to move from a conversation about wealth in a discourse of deficit or of scarcity to one of protecting abundance and existing wealth. This would then shape an inclusive approach, it would seem, to thinking and talking about wealth. So how do we think about investment in line with protecting wealth rather than exploitation or unbridled growth?
Shayla, do you want to take the first?
They're all big questions.
Yeah, they're big questions, and it's hard to kind of give a single answer because I think we're still trying to figure that out. We're still sort of trying to navigate reconciling these different principles and jurisdictions. But I think essentially, I don't know if I have like a solid answer for that really. It's such a fluid problem, and it's an issue that is sort of changing as things evolve. So John, I don't know if you have more insight than I do on this, but.
Well, that's a really good answer, because the answer is that this is the beginning of important work, and this should not be taken as the last word. The Mohawks are going to have different views than the Mi'kmaq, than the Blackfoot, than the Inuit, than the Métis, etc. And so it has to be specific to the place and the people, and you know, you're expressing that in a really powerful way, that we need to be a little cautious in answering these questions. And yet, even as we express that caution, I think the question's a really important one, because it does show that there is an abundance that has surrounded us for millennia as Indigenous peoples. And that doesn't mean that there's not been scarcity, there's not been climate change and collapse in the past that we've experienced as Indigenous peoples and others. But despite the challenges and the opportunities, there are these views within the Indigenous laws that we've studied that have us celebrate, right? We feast for a purpose. Potlatches and circles try to bring out the attention and the mindfulness and the appreciation to the relationships that we have with the plants and animals by giving them names and making them a part of our community, and trying to, in song and story, praise the opportunities that they create for us by being in their midst. And so when you go through some of these sources, you know, they are just uplifting, and they're uplifting with specificity. And so the wonder that we need is that kind of encouragement that's found within those stories. And then we also have the trickster, as Shayla talked about, who is also us, how we can be simultaneously kind and harmful, charming and cunning, selfish and selfless. And so there's this recognition within the stories that even as we're celebrating and looking at this abundance, you know, things can go sideways because of transformations, either in the natural world or humans or societies themselves transform in ways that, like the trickster, could burn us or cause us to lose some of that abundance that we could otherwise be enjoying.
Thank you. And I think that connects to a comment that Hereditary Chief Lian Zhou has made, Shpilmatsian, in the comment section, about how it goes beyond our natural earthly surroundings and includes spiritual considerations, the ancestors, those yet to be. And the reciprocal relationship is interwoven from past, present, and future. The wealth, she notes, is measured on the well-being of children in our current state. So thank you. Is around the intent of the research. Would you say that the intent of this work is to blend the Indigenous laws with the current Canadian law, or to give them a special recognition or status within Canadian law? So I suppose it's around what that reconciliation looks like of these clearly sometimes divergent legal orders.
Well, I think that the intent is multifaceted, which is to open up space for those that are working in this sphere to make decisions that are more informed, that include an attentiveness to Indigenous law and legal orders. And so sometimes that should just be recognized on its own and stop. There's no need to have a conversation with what the Canadian legal implications of that might be. It's just possible within the moment that the community exists in to find ways to advance that. But it's also there in the paper that if people do see that there's possibilities and opportunities or challenges that they want to address that are found in the Canadian law, these things can be brought alongside. And again, they don't have to be integrated, just the contrast and the comparison there might reveal things that the common law and equity might do that wouldn't be maybe as prominent without this contrasting vision there. So it can be just brought to bear on that front. Then there's some instances where there can be intermingling between the systems as we're identifying, and that can occur in so many different ways. In other words, this is not just an either or set of intents. It's not a dichotomy. These things can be picked up along a spectrum according to the needs of the folks that are involved in the work. I noticed one of the questions had to do, would we have any advice for folks that are seeking for investment managers and wealth managers and trustees and fiduciaries? We don't have any specific advice. We want to be careful to say we're not offering legal or investment advice here, but the paper suggests that if you start asking questions of trustees and fiduciaries and wealth managers about their receptiveness, their knowledge of, their willingness to take account of Indigenous law and legal traditions and values and ethics, that might, because they're providing a service, prompt them to do their own due diligence and figure out in the context that they work in, if they're able to do that, if they're not, to tell you why they're not, if they can do it, to the degree to which they can do it, if there's obstacles as to why they can't do it, how they might work with you in overcoming those obstacles, if they're not able to overcome those obstacles, just to be upfront about that and show you what their limitations might be. And so the paper opens up these spaces for a whole wealth of future inquiry that, you know, in constitutional terms, in section 35.1 has gone on for like 40 years. But in the corporate sector and trust and fiduciary law, we really see almost next to nothing in this sphere using the methodologies that we're describing. And so that's, I guess, our hope is just to be educators and to be facilitators and prompters of further discussion.
Thank you. I feel as though I could sit here all afternoon and continue this conversation, but we are aware of the time and that we're nearing the top of the clock. So I think this might be a good place to thank you both to our speakers today for sharing their insights on Indigenous law in relation to fiduciary duty, for working so well on this paper this summer that now is released today. Thank you to all of the folks that have joined us today, and we really hope that this paper fuels further conversations on this important topic. So we would encourage you to start having these discussions with investment managers, with others that you're working with, fellow trustees, within your communities and beyond to see how we can move in this direction and work towards the aims that really have been highlighted by your presentation today. So thank you so much for that. If you'd like to reach out to anyone on our team to continue these discussions, to see, for instance, how we might be able to support your trust, to hear about reconciliation and responsible investment initiatives, broader work, we would welcome that you get in touch with us directly. And you can find the full paper, as I noted, on the website, as well as contact information there too. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.